Richard Harrow was a man no one in Willow Creek ever truly understood, his wife Margaret a silent shadow beside him, and their daughter Emily the spark that vanished before anyone asked why. What began as the quiet tragedy of a missing girl would unravel into one of the darkest mysteries the town had ever known, a hidden collection of lives stolen, memories preserved, and final breaths captured in fragments that still haunt the ground where their house once stood. The house at the edge of Willow Creek had always carried a strange presence. Long before anyone understood why, neighbors avoided walking past it at night. It stood like a silent guard at the end of a cul-de-sac, its peeling white paint and sagging porch suggesting a home forgotten by time. The blinds on the windows were always drawn, the curtains pressed tightly against the glass, making it impossible to tell whether anyone inside ever looked out. Stray cats sometimes lingered near the yard, but even they seemed to leave quickly, as though unsettled by something. Unseen, the Harrow family had once lived there, though their name was rarely spoken. Richard Harrow, his wife Margaret, and their children had been part of the community, but they had never blended in. Richard was a stern man who worked odd jobs and kept to himself. Margaret was polite but distant, the kind of woman who spoke only when necessary. Their eldest daughter, Emily, had vanished one summer night, and after that, the family withdrew even further from the world. The house became a shell of itself, its lights rarely on, its yard unkempt, its silence heavy enough to press down on anyone who passed by. 4 years, the town lived around it, pretending it wasn't there. One October evening, rain swept across Willow Creek. The storm was steady, soaking the cracked sidewalks and collecting in puddles along the roads. The air carried the earthy scent of wet leaves and something else, something heavier, sharper, impossible to ignore. A neighbor named Alan Finch first noticed it. He was carrying trash to the curb when the wind shifted, bringing with it the stench of decay. At first he thought an animal had died in the thickets nearby, but the smell grew stronger the closer he came to the Harrow house. By the time he reached the edge of the yard, the air was thick with rot, the kind of smell that clings to skin and lingers in the nose. Alan hesitated before calling the police. The Harrows had always been private people, and the thought of reporting something about their home filled him with unease. But the odor was undeniable, unbearable even, and eventually he dialed the local station. Hours later, 2 patrol cars rolled quietly down the street, their headlights glinting off the wet pavement. Officers stepped out, their boots sinking into the muddy ground as they approached the front door. No one answered their knocks. After several minutes, they forced their way inside. The interior of the house was dark, the air damp and suffocating. The smell that had drifted outside was even more powerful within. Dust coated every surface, cobwebs stretched across corners, and the rooms felt untouched, as though the family had left in a hurry and never returned. Furniture sat in odd places. Photographs hung crooked on the walls, and a single light bulb flickered weakly above the entryway. The silence inside was so complete that the officers could hear the creak of their own footsteps echoing back at them. They moved deeper into the house until one of them noticed a faint draft seeping from beneath a door that led to the basement. The smell was strongest there. With a shove, the door opened, revealing a staircase that sank into near total darkness. Their flashlights cut through the black, illuminating walls stained by dampness and wood swollen with age. When they reached the bottom, they found something no one in Willow Creek could have predicted. Neatly stacked against the far wall were several large boxes. They were sealed tightly with tape, each marked only with a single number written in black marker. The officers expected to find garbage or forgotten belongings, but when the first box was opened, they froze. Inside lay a collection of items that did not belong together: a woman's scarf, a small collection of photographs, a leather-bound journal, and a child's bracelet. Every box was filled in the same way, containing pieces of someone's life, carefully arranged and preserved as though they were meant to be remembered. The discovery was unsettling not because of what was found, but because of what was missing. There were no bodies, no signs of who these people had been beyond the fragments left behind. The officers realized they weren't standing in an abandoned basement. They were standing in the beginning of a mystery that would peel away the surface of their quiet town and expose the darkness hidden beneath it, detectives worked late into. The night after the discovery in the Harrow basement. Each box was photographed, catalogued, and carried out with the care usually reserved for fragile evidence. As the contents were spread across long tables at the precinct, an unsettling pattern began to take shape. Every collection told the story of someone who had vanished, but not in the way people imagined. These were not high-profile missing person cases. No posters had been stapled to telephone poles. No news bulletins had been issued. The names slowly uncovered belonged to people who had slipped away so quietly that the world hardly noticed. The first box examined held a tattered nurse's badge and a faded photograph of a woman in uniform. Her name was Helen Myers, a nurse who had once worked the night shift at a nearby hospital. She had disappeared on her way home more than 10 years ago. At the time, her absence raised little suspicion. Co-workers assumed she had moved away, and, with no close family in town, no one pursued the matter. The discovery of her belongings in the Harrow basement suggested a different, far darker fate. Another box contained a high school yearbook from 15 years earlier. A single face was circled in pen, Daniel Cross. He had been a quiet teenager, often seen alone, and had run away from home at 17. His parents never filed a report, claiming they thought he had left to start a new life elsewhere. Among his belongings in the box was a necklace engraved with his initials. The realization that his life had not continued somewhere else but had instead ended in silence unsettled the entire investigative team. As the detectives connected the evidence, they began to see a pattern forming. The victims were people who lived on the margins, whose disappearances were easy to overlook. A man who had recently lost his job and was known to wander the streets late at night. A young woman estranged from her family. An elderly widower with no children to check in on him. Each story fit the same profile, individuals who could vanish without setting off alarms. Whoever had placed the boxes in the Harrow home had chosen victims not for who they were, but for how easily they could be forgotten. The unsettling part was that none of the victims' families or acquaintances had ever connected their disappearances to the Harrow family. There were no complaints, no suspicions that pointed to that quiet, crumbling house at the edge of town. It was as if the house had absorbed these lives in secret, tucking them away into its damp basement while the world moved on. The belongings in the boxes became the only proof that these people had once existed. Forensic teams searched every item, looking for DNA, fingerprints, anything that could link the possessions back to the Harrows. The work was slow, and the more they uncovered, the more disturbing the picture became. Each box appeared intentionally curated, with items chosen to represent an entire life. There was always something personal, like a piece of jewelry or clothing. There was always something written, like a diary entry, a letter, or a photograph. And in some boxes, there were things that seemed meaningless, broken trinkets, scraps of paper, but when placed together, they formed an eerie memorial. The detectives began to wonder whether these collections were trophies or something else. They did not resemble the typical evidence of a killer obsessed with power or conquest. Instead, they seemed almost reverent, as though the person who created them believed they were preserving the victims. It was this strange quality that unsettled the investigators more than anything else. The basement did not feel like a dumping ground. It felt like a shrine. Questions grew heavier with each discovery. Who had chosen these forgotten souls? Why had they been taken from lives already teetering on the edge of invisibility? And most haunting of all, where were their bodies? The media eventually learned of the case, and whispers spread quickly through Willow Creek. For years, the town had prided itself on being a quiet, safe place where nothing unusual ever happened. Now, it seemed clear that something sinister had been festering beneath the surface all along. As residents looked at the abandoned Harrow house, its windows still closed tight against the world, many began to wonder how much it had seen, how much it still concealed. The detectives knew they were only scratching the surface. The boxes were fragments, pieces of larger stories that had ended in silence. And somewhere, hidden in the walls of the house or buried in the earth beyond it, the missing breaths of those forgotten lives were waiting to be found. In the days following the discovery of the boxes, investigators returned to the Harrow house again and again. The air inside remained heavy, stale, and difficult to breathe, as if the walls themselves remembered what had been hidden there. The search was methodical. Floorboards were lifted, vents were examined, and every cabinet was emptied. It was during this process that a young officer noticed something odd in the attic. Behind a row of dusty crates filled with broken toys and old clothes, one section of the wall sounded hollow when tapped. The officer pried at it until a panel came loose, revealing a small cavity. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age. The book belonged to Richard Harrow, the patriarch of the family. At first glance, the journal appeared like an ordinary record of a man's thoughts, simple notes about weather, work, and the routines of daily life. But as investigators read further, the entries took a darker turn. Richard wrote of people he encountered in town, describing them not by name but by their solitude, their struggles, and their invisibility. He spoke of a nurse who walked home, alone through the dark, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion, a boy drifting away from family into the arms of shadows, and an old man waiting for someone to remember he once existed. The descriptions were hauntingly close to the lives of the missing people whose belongings had been found in the basement. The entries shifted in tone as the years went on, becoming less about observation and more about action. Richard wrote of taking fragments of people, small pieces of their lives that he believed represented their essence. He seemed to believe he was preserving them, offering them a form of immortality that the world denied them. He claimed that the forgotten deserved to be remembered, and that he alone carried that responsibility. The journal spoke of capturing their final moments, though Richard never described directly how he ended their lives. Instead, he used vague phrases like the moment of silence and the last fragment. What disturbed investigators most was the way Richard wrote about memory. He did not view himself as a killer but as a collector of stories. He believed that by keeping their belongings, he was ensuring that their lives did not simply vanish. Each box in the basement was, in his mind, a monument. The investigators began to understand that Richard's obsession was not fueled by cruelty in the traditional sense. It was built on a twisted sense of purpose, a belief that death was not an ending but a transition into preservation. As the journal neared its final pages, the writing grew erratic. Words were scratched deeply into the paper, ink smeared as though written in haste or agitation. He spoke of his own family only briefly, never with warmth. Margaret, his wife, appeared in only a handful of sentences, always described in cold terms. His children were mentioned sparingly, with Emily, the eldest, standing out in one particularly chilling passage. Richard wrote, "She was the beginning, the one who showed me the truth. Without her, the fragments would not exist. She is the first and the last." Investigators paused when they read those lines, realizing what the implication might be. The most haunting entry of all was found near the end of the journal. Richard had scrawled, "They will search, but they will never find the final fragment. It belongs to me." The sentence was underlined twice, the ink pressing so hard that it tore through the page. Detectives debated its meaning. Did it suggest there was one victim whose body would never be discovered? Or was it a cryptic reference to his own death, his belief that he too would one day be preserved as part of the collection? The journal was bagged as evidence, but its words lingered with those who read them. They were not the rantings of a man, detached from reality in the way investigators often saw. Instead, they were disturbingly deliberate, almost methodical. Richard Harrow had crafted a philosophy around his crimes, one that blurred the line between memory and murder. The fragments he collected were not trophies of conquest but artifacts of a distorted reverence. The attic, once just another dusty corner of the house, became the site of the most important discovery so far. But even with the journal in hand, the mystery remained incomplete. The entries provided glimpses into Richard's mind, but did not explain what had become of the missing bodies. The basement boxes were only half the story. Somewhere, hidden deeper in the house or beyond it, lay the answer to Richard's final words. The investigators left that day knowing that the most unsettling truths were still waiting to be uncovered. The search of the Harrow property stretched into its third week, and by then the house had become a place of dread for the investigators. Assigned to it, each creaking floorboard, each shadowed corner seemed to resist their presence, as though the house itself wanted its secrets to remain buried. Forensic teams brought in specialized equipment, scanning walls for hidden compartments, probing the earth beneath the foundation, and examining every surface for traces of blood or hair. Day after day, they returned with only small fragments, never the whole story. It wasn't until they began focusing on the basement floor that the truth started to surface. The concrete was uneven in several places, patched over with materials that didn't match. It looked like work done hurriedly, without care for appearance. At first glance, it might have been dismissed as repairs for cracks caused by age, but investigators knew better. They brought in tools to break apart the sections, and soon the stale air was filled with the sharp scent of damp soil. Beneath the crumbling floor lay a narrow entrance to a chamber carved directly into the earth. The discovery sent chills through the team, for this was no ordinary hiding place. It was deliberate, carefully concealed from view, and only reachable by tearing away what Richard Harrow had built to cover it when the chamber was illuminated. By flashlights, the scene inside was unlike anything the investigators had encountered. The bodies of at least 6 individuals were found, reduced to skeletal remains yet arranged with unsettling precision. Each one lay on its back, arms folded neatly across the chest, as though placed in rest rather than discarded. Around them were small personal items, a photograph tucked into the ribcage of one, a bracelet draped across another's bones, a shoe carefully placed at the foot of another skeleton. The arrangement felt ceremonial, almost tender, the work of someone who believed he was providing peace instead of committing violence. The sight shook even the most experienced among them. These were not the chaotic scenes of a desperate killer, trying to conceal evidence. This chamber was a ritual space, a place where Richard Harrow had transformed his twisted philosophy into physical form. Each skeleton was another story ended, another fragment preserved in silence. The boxes in the basement now made a grim kind of sense. They were the surface memories, while the chamber beneath held the final remains. But as they catalogued what they found, an even darker realization took hold. The number of skeletons did not match the number of boxes discovered upstairs. There were more boxes than bodies. That meant several victims were still missing, there. Fates hidden somewhere else entirely. The investigators expanded their search to the woods behind the house, following faint paths that Richard had likely taken late at night. Dogs trained in cadaver detection were brought in, their handlers guiding them through the underbrush and along the banks of the creek. It wasn't long before shallow graves were uncovered, each containing bones that had been hastily covered with dirt and leaves, yet even with these discoveries, the numbers still did not add up. Some of the victims whose belongings had been identified remained missing, their resting places undiscovered. The chilling possibility arose that Richard's activities might not have been limited to Willow Creek alone. He had worked odd jobs in neighboring towns and often traveled for weeks at a time. If he had continued his pattern elsewhere, the scope of his crimes could stretch far beyond the borders of the community. The townspeople watched from a distance as investigators carried remains from the property, their faces pale in the glow of police floodlights. For a community that had long believed itself untouched by the world's darker currents, the revelation was unbearable. Parents held their children closer, neighbors whispered about who might have once crossed paths with Richard, and elderly residents recalled moments when they had felt a strange chill in his presence. The Harrow house, once merely an unsettling landmark, had become a symbol of horror. Inside the investigation room at the precinct, the discoveries were laid out in detail. Bones tagged and photographed, belongings sorted into evidence bags, journal. Excerpts pinned to a wall of timelines. Yet despite all this, the case still felt incomplete. The missing bodies haunted the team as much as the ones they had found. And hovering over it all was Richard's cryptic statement, "They'll never find the last fragment. It belongs to me." Those words suggested an endpoint, a conclusion that remained hidden. The basement chamber had revealed the depth of Richard's Obsession, but it had also raised a more disturbing question. What had become of Emily Harrow, the daughter who disappeared before any of this was discovered? Her name had surfaced in his journal, tied directly to the beginning of his philosophy. The investigators now feared that the answer to her fate would lead them to the darkest revelation of all. The search for answers stretched beyond the Harrow property, but the heart of the mystery always returned to Emily Harrow, the daughter, who had disappeared long before the town understood what Richard was capable of. Her absence had been the beginning, the moment when whispers about the family first began to spread. For years, the story in Willow Creek was that she had run away, unable to tolerate her father's rigid rules and her mother's distant silence. Some believed she had started a new life in another state, while others thought she had met with an accident and her parents had quietly buried their grief. Now, with the discovery of the basement chamber and the journal entries, those stories collapsed. Emily had not left of her own will. Her fate was woven into the fragments Richard had collected, though the truth had yet to be uncovered. Investigators combed through every inch of the property again, certain that Richard would not have allowed his first fragment to exist anywhere but close to him. They tore into the walls, sifted through crawl spaces, and dug deeper into the yard. Days turned into weeks, and though more shallow graves were uncovered, none belonged to Emily. The frustration mounted until one final sweep of the house revealed a space overlooked before. Beneath the staircase, behind warped boards coated in dust, a crawl space extended into darkness. The air inside was stale, as if it had not been touched in decades. Within that confined space lay a small, rusted tin box. Unlike the larger containers in the basement, this one seemed personal, hidden, away rather than displayed. Inside was a single object, a child's silver locket engraved with the name Emily. The locket was delicate, its chain broken, but its significance was unmistakable. Alongside it were a few strands of hair tied with ribbon, and a folded note in Richard's handwriting. The note contained only 3 words: "She showed me." The discovery was devastating. It suggested that Emily had not simply been his first victim but had been central to his descent. Perhaps her death had been accidental, the result of a moment of rage or control gone too far. Or perhaps she had resisted him, and in silencing her he had convinced himself he was rescuing others from the same loneliness he believed she suffered. Whatever the truth, Emily had become the foundation of his twisted philosophy. By claiming her as the beginning, Richard had set the path for every fragment that followed. The revelation spread quickly through Willow Creek, igniting sorrow and horror in equal measure. For the townspeople, Emily had been a symbol of youth. Lost, a story left unfinished. Now, she became the first piece of a puzzle that would never fully be solved. Parents who had once comforted themselves by imagining she had built a new life elsewhere were forced to face the reality that her life had ended in silence within the walls of her own home. Richard Harrow's death years earlier meant that no answers could be extracted from him. He had carried his secrets into the grave, leaving only fragments behind to be pieced together. The journals, the boxes, the chamber beneath the floor, all of it painted a picture but never provided certainty. How many victims were there truly? Why had he chosen each one? And what exactly did he mean by the last fragment? Some investigators speculated that Richard believed his own death completed the collection. Others feared there were still undiscovered remains buried in unknown places, waiting silently in the earth. The Harrow house was eventually demolished. Crews tore it down in a matter of days, reducing it to rubble in hopes of erasing the shadow it had cast over the town. But the ground beneath remained untouched, and for many residents, it carried a stain no demolition could remove. People avoided the lot, crossing the street rather than walking past it. At night, some claimed they could still smell the faint trace of decay in the air, as if the earth itself had absorbed the memory of what had happened. For the investigators who had worked the case, the image of the tin box beneath the staircase lingered the longest. It was not the skeletal remains in the chamber, nor the graves in the woods, that haunted them most. It was the small, personal detail of a locket belonging to a young girl whose life had ended before it began, hidden away as though Richard had wanted to keep her for himself forever. That single object carried the weight of everything that followed, a reminder that the story of Richard Harrow was not one of madness alone, but of obsession born in the quietest, most intimate of places, within his own family, the case of the Fragments closed officially with no trial, no confession, and no clear conclusion. But for the people of Willow Creek, it never truly ended. It became part of their town's identity, whispered about at night, passed down in half-finished stories to children who shivered at the thought of walking past the old lot where the Harrow house once stood. And though investigators did their best to bring closure, one truth remained: final breaths are rarely complete. They echo in pieces, scattered like fragments, refusing to be silenced entirely.